right, let's go ahead and bring it back together here. So where were some places that we noticed the law in these readings? Probably lots of places. And much of this was law, very directly. But what were some maybe some places where the law struck us, maybe?
When if a man is jealous or has a hint of jealousy, then the lady is
the ordeal. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in I don't know the page number, but there's the in this translation they call it the jealousy something offering, the jealousy offering, where if a man suspects a woman of adultery, there's this ordeal where she drinks this special water that's been prayed over. I think they call it the water of.
I don't know, but it's got dirt and dust in it from the floor.
Yeah, they mix dust in it, and then that reveals whether she's been faithful or not. Basically, if there's no symptoms, then she's innocent. If there are symptoms, then her husband's suspicions are confirmed. Yeah, isn't that an interesting thing? One thing I will say about that is that provides an out. Whereas typically the husband's jealousy would be the last word, here it's not. There is God's word is understood to be the last word here. So this is something that's a little different from what a cultural understanding would be.
So there's some grace in it?
Actually, yeah, this is a way that the woman can actually be shown innocent against her husband's jealousy, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, good. So we see two things of the law there. I just want to point this out. The law is attacking. The law always accuses us. It always finally, we find ourselves under the accusation of it. But it also, in the meantime, preserves life, right? So the law is doing two things. It's preserving life here in this world, but it doesn't finally deliver us from death. In fact, as we see again and again, the law, what are the punishments? Almost always death, right? Death is very often a punishment in these laws. Yeah. So notice that there's two things that the law is doing. That continues to be true. Yeah, what else?
I thought it was interesting that after you gave restitution or done whatever you were supposed to, you were unclean until twilight.
Ah, yeah.
And then you were okay.
So noticing many of the purifying, becoming clean when you've become unclean, making yourself clean again, that you do whatever is prescribed, and then you are unclean until twilight, until sundown, and then then it's a new day, literally. Remember, evening, then morning, and now you are clean again. Yeah. So again, this is part of the law's preserving of life. It's offering a way for people to enter back into life. So there is, something like grace or forgiveness under the law. It's not quite what we mean by the gospel, but it's there. Yeah.
I just want you to describe what unclean
Good.
is in that original language.
Yeah.
What was it?
So the question is, what is unclean in the original language? The word in Hebrew is tameh, which doesn't really help you much, but that is the word in Hebrew. Unclean is essentially a designation that means not to approach the tabernacle. I mean, that's at its very simplest, not to approach, I guess, God in worship there. So to be unclean is to have to be separate from the tabernacle. To be clean is to be in a state where you can go to the tabernacle. That's essentially the difference. It's more complicated than that a bit. So that's one way of in the text. Over time, especially by the time of Jesus, we see this, and even in Numbers a little bit, there's everyone who is unclean with certain things has to go outside the camp. Did you notice that in our Numbers reading? Over time, there's a real stigma that will come to that, where uncleanness seems to have gone beyond this sort of, it's not quite neutral, but something close to sort of morally neutral. Unclean doesn't mean immoral in these texts. By the time of Jesus, it sort of seems to, that there's this real oh, you're unclean, you need to stay away, and there's this real stigma that's come with it. That's not as clear in the Old Testament, in the originals anyways. It seems to change over time. The other thing I'll say about uncleanness is it seems clean and unclean are categories that don't map onto any modern categories that we really have, except there are people who carry some sort of uncleanness for us. So that's going to change depending on where you are. But there are people with whom you do not want to associate, that you sort of have an inner, I shouldn't be around that sort of person. Sometimes that can take the form of racism, right, or other sorts of prejudices. Sometimes that takes the form of, well, this is a person who is a drug addict, or if you've been around someone who is quite mentally ill, like maybe, ranting on the streets, that sort of thing. The person talking to themselves on the bus, whatever it is. That there's a sense that you sort of keep yourself away from them. There's something to that in the uncleanness. So we can also see that, like, even without the law, I think these categories of clean and unclean would still exist. They would be defined a little differently, but people would still have this sense of like, oh, here's a person I need to avoid. Here's a person I can be close to. And what the law actually does is it gives a method of transitioning someone from being unclean to being clean. So there's actually some, again, this is part of the law facilitating life together. Yeah?
Is it like a spiritual toxicity?
Spiritual toxicity. Yeah, maybe. Maybe you could talk about it that way. I'd have to think a little bit more about exactly what that means. But part of the concern in the Torah and what we're reading is that God's holiness is dangerous, right? I've mentioned this several times. Holiness, and not just, the God of Israel, any God's holiness, in that ancient mindset is dangerous. And it's especially dangerous if it gets close to whatever uncleanness is. So it's like you have to sort of keep these two things, holiness and uncleanness, separate from each other. It's not that unclean is the opposite of holy, but they're not supposed to mix. It's if you handle them wrong, there could be some sort of outbreak of wrath, of plague, which we see a few times in Numbers, right, where there's plague breaks out among the people. And they're like, oh, I didn't even, there was no mention of a plague, but suddenly the plague stopped that we hadn't even been told of. But it's just sort of understood that that's what happens when holiness, when divinity gets too close to, mortality, I guess. Notice how that's challenged in the incarnation, right? When God becomes mortal in Jesus, there's something deeply offensive about that, even in the time of Jesus. There's something deeply offensive that God would be mortal. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Was the cleanliness unique to Israelites, or is it a lot of tribes?
So the question is, was the cleanliness unique to Israelites? Something like this existed in a lot of cultures at the time. I don't know the details beyond that, but many cultures, in fact, maybe all cultures, have had some forms of purification, right? Of some kind of ritual that allows you to be close to the divine, to the gods, whatever it is. And that's always existed. And I would argue even in modern times, we have versions of it. They tend to be very hygienic, right? Or kind of medically scientific in orientation, because that's the way we think. But there are certain things that you do that sort of, if you've ever had a real hard day, maybe, and you've gone and you take a shower to sort of wash the day away. There's a lot of that in Leviticus, right? You bathe, you wash it, and then it's gone the next when sundown. There's something to that. There's something deeply human about it. Go on, yeah.
We do that. Look at our past 5 years. We do that, and we say you're in seclusion for 7 days.
Yep.
We just did that.
Yeah. So noticing how in COVID we have done many of these same things, isolation.
Yeah.
In some ways, we all became unclean. Actually, you could really do some interesting thinking about the way mask wearing worked, or vaccination status, right? So here are people who are unclean, and maybe there's some scientific reason for it, right?
Yeah.
But stay away from those. I have to say, even when we were talking about coming back into the sanctuary and how will we do seating, there was pushback about, well, we don't want anybody who's unvaccinated to sit in the same section as us, right?
Yeah.
That sounds similar to what's happening here, right?
Yeah. So I thought maybe some of the law was for practical reasons, because they were establishing society, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Establishing society. So practical reasons. I think all of these are meant to, like I said, facilitate life. Now, they do it in a way that's very foreign to us, but yeah. Go ahead.
It describes fear.
Yeah. It describes fear, too. There's a fear of the unclean, which actually really isn't there in Leviticus. Leviticus is quite neutral about it. I don't get the sense that they're afraid of the unclean.
They're afraid of the clean.
They're afraid of the clean. They're afraid of the holy. They're for sure afraid of the holy. The holy is fearful. And holy and clean aren't the same thing. They're different. So your sort of normal status, you would be clean, but you would not be in contact with holiness. You'd be clean as sort of the neutral place, and then the opposite of holy actually is profane or common, and so you would be clean and common. That would be kind of the way you'd normally go throughout the day. Sometimes you would become unclean and then you'd become clean again. If you had to go to the tabernacle, or if you're a Levite, for example, you are much more holy. The thing that's interesting in Leviticus is there's that command, you, all of Israel, are to be holy as I am holy. So there's this sense that the nation is held to a higher standard. I'm not even sure higher is the right word, but held to a different standard because they're to be a nation of priests. Right? There's this language happens in Leviticus, picked up again in the New Testament as well, a royal priesthood. And so in another culture where it would only be the tabernacle or temple elite people that would have to deal with holiness, in Israel there's a sense that no, God's interested in relationship with all of the people. So the holiness is not just limited to this small group, although some people are more involved with it out of necessity than others. Most gods in the ancient world are content, it seems, to deal just with the priests and never deal with the common people very directly. But this God wants to be. This God is a jealous God, right? This God wants to be in relationship with all the people. Yeah. What about the gospel? Where do we notice the gospel? It's there.
The continual getting back to the promise that God will deliver the people to the land.
So it's constant returning to the promise that God is going to deliver the people to the land. Yes, good. So this is God dealing with the people on the basis of a promise which is not going to be fulfilled in the lifetime of that first generation that comes out of Egypt as the story goes on, right? Mm-hmm. A promise that they have to wait for. Yeah. Where else? Yeah.
When he says on page 276, fix these words of mine in your hearts and mind, tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your forehead.
This is today's preaching text that you're quoting. This is perfect. Yeah, so on to page 276, which is a little ahead of actually where our reading needs to be, but that's okay, because it is in this coming week's reading. And it is today's preaching text. Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands. Bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children. Talking about them when you sit at home, when you walk on the road, and so on. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Page 204.
204.
Lord bless you and keep you.
Yes, I was hoping that one would come up. So on page 204, the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. This sounds familiar, right? The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. We usually translate that, look upon you with favor. But that's literal. This is a more literal translation. Turn his face to you, which is understood to be good. Now, turning his face against you, the turning of the face can be good or bad. Here it's good, right? So the Lord do this to you. That is the gospel. That's good. Mm-hmm. What surprised you?
I was surprised to run into the Nephilim again.
Yes, I was. That is an interesting thing. So I was surprised to run into the Nephilim again was the comment. So remember we heard about Nephilim in Genesis 5 or 6, way back at the beginning before the flood. The men of renown were on the earth in those days. And it seems like if all were wiped out and Noah's family is the only lineage left, then how are there Nephilim now? But according to Numbers, there are. So at least the people think there are, right? And the narrator seems to confirm that, the writer, author of Numbers, the speaker of Numbers, I guess, that there's these, formidable warriors in the land who are descendants of Anak, right? Who are among the Nephilim somehow. So, great question. How are they there? Doesn't seem like they should be. I think I'd agree with that. And yet, somehow these are here.
They were afraid of them, but then it says their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid.
Yeah. So you hear that? The Lord is with us. Do not be afraid. This is this is Caleb, I think, speaking there, maybe? Yeah. We will be okay. Now, most people don't listen to that, right? This was our preaching text last week. But yeah.
Third days, we talk about God and forgiveness.
Yeah.
So far, it seems like God's forgiveness is death, or in this process that we're going through here, he's very angry all the time. That surprised me a little bit.
Yeah, so surprised about the sort of the character of God here. God seems very angry. I will say God, we call the Hebrew, the way the Jews refer to these 5 books is the law, right? These are the books of the law. We tend to use that too. And this is primarily about law. There's gospel throughout this, right? But here God is doing something. Paul will call Moses' ministry the ministry of death. This is what Paul calls it in the New Testament. That Moses' job, God-appointed job, was a job of death dealing, finally. That's what the law was given for. And that the death dealing is so that God can have mercy in resurrection on Jesus. So that there is this constant death and resurrection. So Paul in Romans, when we get to Romans, which is going to be months down the road, this is part of how he's dealing with this and how the tradition deals with this. So there is forgiveness. We had it in that Numbers reading from last week. God wants to wipe the people out, and Moses pleads for them, and God says, I have forgiven them, just as you said. So there is forgiveness there.
On page 216, it says, the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love and forgiving sins and rebellion. He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sins of parents. To the third, fourth generation, in accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them on that day of Egypt.
Good. So that's exactly the quote. And that's Moses quoting God back to God. Do you notice that? Moses is quoting God to God. So God says, I want to wipe out these people. I'll start again with you, Moses. And Moses says, but Lord, as you said, you are a Lord, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, yet not leaving the guilty unpunished. So there is both law and gospel here, right? The witness that is going to become more obvious, it's not as obvious at this point, is that the gospel is the last word. You even have it here. So even in the Ten Commandments, God says, I can't remember how it's translated here, but punishing children for the iniquity of their parents to the second and third generation, or third and fourth generation, right? But showing steadfast love to the thousands, or I think a better translation, the 1,000th generation, which there haven't even been that many generations since then, by the way. The 1,000th generation of those who love me. So even here, though both are present, there's an asymmetry in that the steadfast love, the gospel, the grace is bigger. And in fact, I think as more I read, God has a big temper as portrayed in this, and yet is sort of a softie, ready to relent from punishing, right? Easily talked out of it. The God has a big tantrum, maybe for Moses' sake sometimes, I think. It sort of feels that way to me. Tantrums maybe a little strong, but I'm just going to get rid of these people, and then is talked out of it again and again and again. That there's something of grace there. But it is not fully realized yet. Yeah. Good. What other surprises do we have? Yeah.
So a few weeks back, I'm behind, but where...
Yeah, we haven't spoken for a few weeks. So that's all right.
But back in Leviticus, just the ceremony and procedure for making Aaron and his sons priests.
Aaron's ordination ceremony and his son's ordination ceremony, yeah.
It almost seems like that would be something you would see like as defined as like a pagan worship.
Oh, that's interesting.
The blood splashing on the altar.
Yeah, there's something that feels like pagan worship. I'm repeating for the recording there. Yeah, that is surprising. I think so. There's this. I think I've mentioned this with this group. There's this concept, theological concept. I think it goes back to John Calvin. So I'll be slightly Calvinist for a minute here. That called accommodation. That God is accommodating to the people in Revelation. That basically instead of sort of saying, this is the way things are and always should be, God says, okay, this is what you understand now. I'm going to come to you in forms and symbols that you can make sense of, and yet sort of challenge them. So the ordeal that we talked about at the beginning, the ordeal with the woman whose husband is jealous, is entering into a culture where the husband's jealousy is all that matters, essentially. Like the husband's word is final. And it's sort of taking that, and yet it's challenging it a little bit. It's introducing something that now the husband's word's not the last word. That this ordeal, somehow God is the one who has the last word somehow through this. That's not unique to these cultures. There's ordeals, trials in all sorts of cultures. This is a common thing. They might not look exactly like this, but this thing is happening. But there's something where God maybe is accommodating to worship that looks very similar to those around them. The temple, we haven't gotten to the temple yet, but when the building of the temple is described, it is exactly the sort of temple you'd expect to see in any of those ancient Middle East cultures to any god. They even, when David's son Solomon has the temple built, they hire a foreigner to do it because those are the experts in temple building. They know how to do it. And there's something like, there's something about using these forms that the people will understand. But even the temple itself is never regarded fully positively within Scripture. That's always in tension. So, good.
Is there any intention with the direction that it was so obvious? I mean, right now, you see certain religions in the morning will pray to the east.
Oh.
It opens up the door to the east, and then to the evening with the west, with the setting suns. I was wondering if there was any significance about that.
That's a good question. So the question is about direction, like in Islam, for example, you pray facing Mecca, which is broadly east from here. I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good question. Yeah, I think there's a hand here. Yeah.
So this is just an observation. About 40 years ago, there were discussions in the group in the church I went to because television had changed, and it went from being not so violent to being more and more violent and more and more graphic.
Mm-hmm.
And the discussion was that our minds were being seared to the violence and the graphic situation. And now we're in a society with mass shootings, and people take courses in how to stop blood, and it's very different. It occurred to me when I was reading this is that the violence that God is requesting regarding animals, is that kind of searing the Israelites to get used to that blood and violence, so that when they go into the promised land and they're told to annihilate the different tribes,
interesting,
they can actually do it without, there's so much I used to see that was like, I can't look at that.
Yeah.
Now,
all right, I'm going to try and restate that for the recording as well as I can. That's an interesting thought. So the question is, talking about how television and more graphic, especially violent content on television, and this is maybe a discussion from decades ago, more so than today, desensitizes us to violence, or might desensitize us to violence. And the wondering was, is the sacrificial system with its violence towards animals, though I would say that the sacrificial system is not understood as violence exactly, even though it is killing. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Is desensitizing the Israelites, preparing them for the warfare that they are going to have to enter into in the land, and actually already do some in numbers. My first comment on that is, I think the violence of the sacrificial system is something that would be familiar to anyone who has had to slaughter animals for food themselves. So we live in an age where we are very, in a sense, sensitized to that because we are so distant from what actually goes into the production of our meat. Most of us, we have, it comes wrapped in plastic. It's very clean. That's all I know. I don't have to actually. I've never even hunted. I've never had to skin an animal or any of those things. Fish, I guess, is the closest I've come. So the first is, I don't think there would be anything shocking about what's described in Leviticus to the ancient people. I think this is part of life for them.
That's what they have to do. Well, the sacrifices, but just eating, they have to kill in order to survive.
Yeah, and most of the sacrifices are eaten. I think that's something that we don't there's only certain sacrifices that are actually not eaten. They're called whole burnt offerings. Those ones are special, and they're fairly rare, but those are the ones where the entire animal is burned. And when it's burned, like the way Leviticus talks about it, it's turned into smoke. Literally is what it says. So that's why I said they don't exactly understand it as violence. It's not about the killing of the animal. It's about the giving of the animal to God. And the way that you get it there is you turn it to smoke. And that's how it gets there. And then God, it's a pleasing aroma. God breathes it in, right? Through the divine nostrils, whatever those look like up there. So that's, again, I think some of this accommodation language is helpful there. But the other thing is, there's some debate about what Leviticus's intent is. But one way to read Leviticus in particular is that the only time you are allowed to slaughter animals is in connection with the tabernacle sacrificial system. So anytime you want to eat meat, you sacrifice some of it at the tabernacle, and then you take the rest of your meat and you eat it.
That explains why there's so many reasons to slaughter animals.
Yeah, you got to have meat all the time. Yeah.
Right.
Uh-huh.
And I did wonder what they did with it. So they're feeding the people.
So the Levites, the priests, will eat some of it. So some of their pay, in a sense, comes from the sacrifices, certain sacrifices. There's always a part of the animal that's reserved for God. So and this is complicated, but the innermost part of the animal is always reserved for God. That's always burned, which is the intestines. And if you imagine how a cow is shaped, if you go in through the chest, the innermost part that you'll find is reserved for God. But in general, the meat, the hindquarters, all of the things that we eat and more are things that can be eaten. The priest is supposed to put a fork in and take, for certain offerings. There's things called wave offerings. A wave offering is basically something that's presented. Actually, something that's close to a wave offering is when we receive the offering, the money offering in Sunday worship, we take it up and we put it on the altar. And sometimes we'll hold it up and put it. And it's, we're not really doing anything there except sort of just saying, well, this is, now given for this. We don't, now then we take it out of there and we go and we, deposit it and make use of it, right? But wave offerings are the same thing. So wave offering is something that's not consumed at all. It's just basically presented and then, eaten or whatever the thing is. The Levites are taken as a wave offering. Did you notice that in Numbers? When God says, all the firstborn are mine, and the Levites are sort of presented in place of the firstborn, the tribe of Levi, that they're presented as a wave offering. It means, I don't know how it looked exactly, but they maybe just paraded in front of the altar, and there was sort of a symbolic, you belong to God now. Yeah, I don't think they had to pick them all up and wave them around.
What was the purpose of that? Was it so they would serve the...
Yeah, good. Okay, so the question is about the Levites here. So have you noticed how many tribes there are? How many tribes are there?
There should be 12.
We hear 12. How many tribes do we see listed most of the time?
2 or 3?
13.
Yeah, 13.
So, for example, if we go to Numbers, when it's describing the way that they're all laid out, and I've got to find it.
All of them are still with the Israelites in the Israelite camp?
Yes, these are all part of Israel still.
2:10.
Yeah, here we go. Here, 2:10. Although I don't think that's right. 193. Okay, let's try that one. Yeah, right at the beginning of Numbers. Yeah. So in this listing, if you count the number of tribes that are listed by number, you'll get 13, except 2 of them are under the sons of Joseph. Right? So Israel has 12 sons. Jacob has 12 sons. One of them is Joseph. Joseph has 2 sons of his own, Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh are most of the time treated as their own tribe. They're even, when the land is apportioned, which is, they have their own tribal land holdings. They're seen as separate. So that makes 13, except who does not get any land? Levi. Levi does not get any land. The Levites become dedicated to temple or tabernacle at this point service, right? They're the ones who, when the camp is laid out and there's 4 tribes in every direction from the tabernacle in the center, there's three in every direction. It's 4 sets of 3, so there's 12, and then the Levites are the middle. They're sort of separate. So there's always sort of, sometimes we'll talk about the half tribe of Ephraim and the half tribe of Manasseh to make the math work out. Because 12 tribes is the way it's talked about, but there's one tribe that's a 13th that's dispersed among the others in a sense, and that's Levi, and is a particular. And the way that that's kind of explained or used in Numbers is that because of Passover, all of the firstborns of Israel belong to God, right? We hear that again. You have to redeem your firstborn. And then they go through this thing where they count up how many Levites there are, and they count up how many firstborn males there are, and there's like 200 more firstborn males than there are Levites. And so God takes the Levites as a wave offering plus 200 cattle. I can't remember, whatever, to make the numbers. But there's this, it's important that it adds up, this sort of symbolic giving of the Levites, dedicating them to the work of the temple. Historically, as you go forward, and we'll see this a little bit, Levites become priests, and even sort of like traveling priests. In Judges, there's a story of this traveling Levite who a family comes in and he works at their own kind of personal shrine. I mean, it gets once they get into the land, things get very complicated and very different than we're seeing sort of this is how things ought to be in an ideal world, and then they get into the land and everything goes quite differently. Good. Was there any other surprise questions?
Just going back to the back a couple of conversations about the meat sacrifice, even if you're eating meat, is that kind of the first tithing?
Oh, it is tithing. Yeah, no, exactly. So the taking sacrifice or taking your meat and sacrificing, and the priest gets some of that it is giving for the priests. It is giving to the tabernacle. Yeah, no, that's exactly what that is.
So John, if they were getting meat, how come they were complaining about meat?
Great question. Yeah. So there's some. So the question was, if they're getting all this meat from the sacrifices, then why are they complaining about not having any meat? So I think I've mentioned this before, but throughout this sort of wilderness narrative, there's at least two layers going on here. So there's sort of I don't know, if you were there with a camera, what you would see with a camcorder, recording, which seems to be this experience of man in the wilderness with occasional quail, right? And that's what there is. And then there's this sort of looking back at that time and projecting the realities of life in the land back onto what it was in the wilderness, because the instructions come from there, that there's sort of this it hasn't happened yet, but it's going to happen. And so at the time that these books are put in, they're sort of reading back on it through this lens. So there's sort of two layers here, and they don't quite match historically. Even the numbers, so there's these real specific, there's this many people, this many people, this many people. I'm not sure how much to take that exactly literally, or rather than understanding it somewhat symbolically, as sort of presenting a picture of what Israel ought to look like, or something like what Israel ought to look like when it's in the land. And to some extent, when they're in the land, immediately that falls through. And so they're sort of yearning back to, this is what it's supposed to be. They're sort of having this, you can think of the law this way. The law has set a goal for them that they are consistently unable to attain. And we're going to see throughout the Bible that we're consistently unable to attain that. Paul, again, will say that's the point of the law. Actually, it was to set a goal that we actually cannot attain, to reveal our own need for God, essentially, and to stop us from pursuing God according to the law, to realize actually we can only do this by relying on grace, on God's promise. So that's the way that Paul will eventually understand this. But at this point, we're still in that first giving of the law. So there's some questions about how much of this is historical and not, historical in the sense of if you were there with a camcorder, you would see it. And those questions are really hard to answer. So I'm not gonna try and speculate too much about it. I try to stick to the text as it is, but notice those layers there. They are there. Yeah.
I wondered about when they described the ancient altar that they had. It had horns.
Oh yeah, the horns of the altar. Yeah.
I wonder how those went away and how ours altar today compares to the
interesting.
Ancient altar.
Yeah, so noticing the horns of the altar, which I think would be kind of raised corners at each. If you imagine a square or rectangular slab, kind of, the corners would be up. And I don't know exactly the reason for that, but it seems to be a thing. But noticing the way, why don't our altars have horns? Our altar has lots of points near the top of it. Maybe that could be something close to horns. But another way of talking about that is what is the difference between the altar in a Christian church and the altar described here, the tabernacle altar. Let's think about that. What's the same and different between those things?
Depends on the church.
Depends on the church. Let's say our church. Let's be more specific.
It had handles on it so you could carry it.
So this is mobile. This has to be a mobile altar in the book. Our altar is a little bit mobile. I mean, it used to be out from the wall. Now it's against the wall, but not very mobile. Yeah. What about the use of the altar? What's the purpose of the altar in Leviticus Numbers? Like, why does the altar exist? Sacrificial. Giving animals and other things to God through the mechanism of smoke. Right? I mean, that's basically what it is. What's the purpose of our altar? Sacraments. Excellent. I hear communion. And what's happening in communion? Are we giving things to God? God's giving something to us. So this is something sometimes called the sacramental reversal. There's a difference between sacrifice and sacrament. Sacrifice is giving something to God, which we do in offerings, right? So there is a place in which the altar functions in that way. But the primary function of the altar, to the extent that a lot of Protestant churches will call it a table rather than an altar, because it's like a eating table that you serve around, is that God is giving something to us. And that's the reversal of the sacrament. Rather than our approach in that sense to God being the primary, it's God's gift to us. Now that exists in the old altar too, right? That there is the sense of like forgiveness comes out of the sacrificial system. So even there's a sense that it's not all straight to God. But yeah, so good. I'm glad that we noticed that, because that's important to notice. Good.
I have two things, but I think they're too much for the time we have. The talking donkey.
Balaam and the talking donkey. Yeah.
When they took, they said Aaron's going to die, and they took him up to the mountain and took his clothes off and put him on his son, and then left him there.
And then he died. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, okay, what was that? Was that murder, suicide, or old age and die?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the two questions were Balaam's donkey. It wasn't even a talking, just a question, just noticing this donkey that talks. It's an interesting story. And then Aaron's death, basically, where they take him up on the mountain, they transfer his priestly garments to his son, the sort of, you're next, and Aaron dies there. And it's not real clear how or why. Like, is it old age? Is it... my sense is, I was trying to make sense of that too as I was reading it. And the way I imagine it is he's close to death, and then he sort of takes his last breath, and that's it. But I don't think they killed him on the mountain. But beyond that, I can't say much for sure. Yeah. That is an interesting one. The talking donkey. This is a wonderful story for preachers, because if God can use a donkey, God can probably use me too. The Balaam story feels incomplete. I don't know if you notice this. So you have Balaam, who everything we see about Balaam is, well, I'll do whatever the Lord tells me, right? I'll do whatever, Yahweh, the God of Israel, basically tells me to do. And he's very consistent about that, everything we see. And then there's this story where it seems like his intention is actually not to do that, or it's sort of implied, but it's never stated explicitly. And so the angel of God is on the road stopping him, and the donkey keeps going to the side. The thing I love about that story most maybe is he yells at the donkey, and the donkey turns and responds to him, and he doesn't even break a step stride. He's just like, it's like, why do you do this? It's like, have I ever done this for you before? He's like, well, no, but you're arguing with a donkey now. Yeah, okay. And Balaam just seems to sort of take it, like there's no real comment on the extraordinariness of it.
Well, Balaam wasn't he a different religion?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so he was just being used by God, and he wasn't...
Yeah, although he seems, at least in the way he's portrayed, he's self-consciously aware that it's the Lord, and it's that capital Lord.
But was that out of fear?
That he's serving. I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. Is it out of fear? Later on, we'll hear bad things about Balaam too. Yeah. But I think in this story, Balaam really comes across as faithful, actually. Yeah. So that's why I said it sort of feels incomplete to me. And I'm not quite sure what to do with that. Somebody might have a better explanation of that than I do. But yeah, but it's it's a wonderful story though of just the figure of as it's traditionally called, Balaam's ass that is able to talk. And if God can use that, God can use just about anything. Yeah, Laura.
Are the 12 tribes chose like the 12 disciples later?
So are the 12 tribes like the 12 disciples
Did
later?
Jesus choose
Yeah.
12 to...
I think so. Yeah. So why does Jesus have 12 disciples? I think probably it's somewhat representative of the 12 tribes. Not that each of them is from a tribe. I think there are traditions of that. Also, how many apostles are there? We talked about how many tribes are there. How many apostles are there? Right?
You mean in the New Testament?
Yeah, in the New Testament. How many apostles are there? So Jesus he has his 12. There's more than 12, but he has the special 12. And then Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus, kills himself. They appoint another one, Mattathias, to become an apostle. We never hear about him again. But there needs to be 12. They make it 12. And then who's the most prominent apostle in the New Testament? Paul. Paul is the most prominent apostle. He is not one of the 12. He never meets Jesus, at least except for his encounter on the road to Damascus. He never meets Jesus pre-crucifixion and resurrection.
So weren't there a lot?
So there's sort of 13 special apostles, sort of 12. But there's also, then there's more that are named apostles throughout the New Testament. It's a broader term. All I mean to say is that it is that sort of symbolic, but it's also kind of loose in the same way that the 12 tribes of Israel is like 12, but it's kind of 13. Sometimes these numbers are sort of symbolic more than they are being exact, if that makes sense. Good. Let's see. I have a couple things I want to say in our last few minutes. So the first one is, and I think I've talked about this already, but as we're reading this, and I talked about this in my sermon last week, I think it was, or maybe the last 2 weeks. This is something that the books of Moses are addressed specifically to Israel, right? This is especially Israel's law. It's important and useful for us to read, but it doesn't make every command in here applicable to us. Sometimes there are Christian groups that want to say everything that's here is applicable. Even the 10 Commandments are not exactly a directly simple application to us because they come from Moses. The 10 Commandments are helpful because they reflect the way the world is. They reflect what we call natural law, the sort of way things ought to be. Maybe you could say general morality, something like that. And so the first is, as we're reading this, just remember, we're reading this as outsiders. We're not reading this as insiders. But we're reading about and learning about a God that we also are in relationship to through Jesus. So that's the first thing I want to mention. The last thing I want to mention is, and I think it came up a little bit, when we talked about the warfare that's going to happen as they enter the land, and actually is already starting here to happen. This is something, so there's this term, and in the NIV, in our translation, it's usually termed as utterly destroy. Yeah. So they'll be utterly destroyed. The word in Hebrew is cherem, and so this is sometimes called cherem warfare in Hebrew. And this is a specific kind of warfare, which older translations will say put to the ban, or sometimes put to the sword, I think, or destroy by the sword or something like that. Other translations do it a different way. But it's basically this, we could call it total war, this complete exterminating, destroy everything. People, animals, possessions, property, that everything must be destroyed. A couple comments on that. First off, this is something that even in Scripture is very specifically only ever applied to this particular time of entering Judah. This isn't something that happens elsewhere. This isn't sort of God's preferred mode of warfare or something like that. This is what is commanded only in this spot. That's the first thing to notice. Second thing to notice is it doesn't seem ever to actually have been carried out. And even in Joshua, for example, when we get to Joshua is a story of cherem warfare as they are driving the other peoples out of the land. And at the very beginning of Judges, which is the very next book after Joshua, it says, here's all the peoples that didn't get driven out of the land. And it gives this long list. And you get the sense that this whole thing was really incomplete and it was never completely done. The last piece is, why would God command this, right? And I think, so one, did it historically happen? Maybe, in limited ways, but certainly not in the sort of idealized form that maybe we see here. Why would God command something like that? What do we do with God's command of something like that? One thing I will say, remember this, we talked about accommodation and challenging what's before. if you are in the ancient world, why do you go to war? What's the purpose of going to war? Any thoughts?
To preserve your life.
So perhaps to preserve your life if someone else is attacking you. Okay. Land, to take land. What else? What's another reason you might go to war? What's that?
Power.
Power, what kind of power?
Anarchy, right of ownership of the land and controlling the country.
So ownership of land, control of area. Okay, yeah.
Control of people.
Control of people.
Yes.
Slaves. So the standard war practice of that time, and not just that time in that place, but in that time, is you go and you kill all the males who are who can resist you, basically, and you take the women as your slaves, and you take any other people's children that you can enslave, safely without being a threat to you, and you make them slaves. So you go to war because you want to take their resources, literally the people, and the things that they have. You want to take their wealth, you want to take their gold, you want to take their food, and you want to have control of the land. Land control is a bit different in the ancient world than it is today. Today we have very firm borders. This is a modern thing, partly because there's oil in the ground. It really matters who controls the oil, right? I mean, that's something that matters. In the ancient world, you don't have these. You have more kind of areas of influence, and there's areas that are going to be kind of gray in between. There's not real hard and fast borders like we're used to today. So it's not exactly territory in the same sense, except that it is sort of influence. So it's connected, but it's not exactly the same. But Cherem warfare does not allow any of the normal motivations for warfare, except for land, to come into play. What do the people get for going to war? How are the soldiers paid? When you go to war, how do you pay your army? They take what they want. That's their pay. Their pay is that they get to take the spoils, the booty that they take from the cities. So how do you recruit people to go to war? This happened as recently as the Crusades. This happens. You say, well, you can take whatever spoils you get. That's why people go to war. There's no standing professional armies. You're not being paid a salary. You're being called and rallied, and your payment is whatever you get to take, including people. Cherem warfare doesn't allow any of that. So I think Cherem warfare is incredibly disturbing to us, and I think it's intended to be disturbing to Israel as well, actually. I think the idea of this is that Cherem is something that is, it is exceptional, and it's unpleasant, and it's not, if anything, it should put a bad taste for warfare in the Israelites' mouth, because they don't have anything to point to it. Now, in the passages we're going to read, there's a little bit of Cherem warfare that we hear in Numbers. Deuteronomy is going to be is pretty much just more. It's Moses' final speech to Israel before they enter the land, and then Joshua is all about Cherem warfare. That's what the book of Joshua really is, and including you'll have these strange things where people are punished for not killing everybody. That's going to happen because they have taken them as their slaves, or because they want to keep them to negotiate some kind of power with them if they're royalty, or they have taken the gold, the idols, the something, and they've kept them to enrich themselves. Basically, this sort of warfare you cannot enrich yourself with. It's just a warfare that makes no sense economically to wage. That doesn't make it moral, right? So I'm not. This isn't me sort of morally justifying Cherem warfare here. That's not what I'm trying to do. But noticing that this is extreme, and it's meant to be extreme. And I think it's meant to be extreme so that Israel has a bad taste for it. I think that's actually part of the reason, that this is a one-time and never again sort of event. Something like the flood, right? Once and never again kind of event. And then also there's the challenge of how historically did this actually carry out. And according to seeming, we'll get this when we get to Judges, it doesn't seem like it actually was carried out all that effectively, right? So, yeah. Any questions on that? So this week we are in finishing up the book of Numbers and getting into Deuteronomy. And then we finish Deuteronomy the following week. So. And then we are done with the Torah. We are out of the books of Moses after book 8, out of the law, as it's called. So the reading will get easier in the sense that we will be back in narrative and stories. It will be harder in the sense that some of those stories, especially in Judges, are very hard to read. So some of the Genesis ones that are, just violent and difficult, there's a few like that in Judges as well. So we've got our work cut out for us for the next few weeks is all I have to say. But I hope you continue to be enriched by this and to be challenged by this and to wrestle through that. Let me close this in prayer. Gracious God, I thank you again for your graciousness to us. I ask that you would open yourself to us in these difficult texts, that you would find ways to speak to us, that we would be interpreted by what we find here, even as we interpret them for ourselves. And we ask above all that you would use these to draw us closer to Jesus, to your Son, to whom you have shown us forgiveness of sins, and through whom you have given us eternal life. I ask for this and everything else in Jesus' name. Amen.